Hi everyone and welcome to the Helios demo. Today we're going to cover a quick demo of what exactly Helios is, and we're going to cover some use cases and as well as setting up those use cases from scratch. You may have seen the 5-minute video version of exactly the same demo, but this is just going to be the longer version of that where we're going to create the cluster from scratch, all the schemas, the pipelines, Kafka topics, and visualizations. So you'll see the entire process of working with Helios in this demo, and we'll cover a couple different use cases to make sure that all our bases are covered. The first use case is a fictional utilities company that has smart meter data coming in from thousands of these meters. It's essentially an IoT use case. But this problem applies to any other vertical that has a lot of data coming in, especially from a lot of different data points. Again, smart meter data is growing at a volume that's really hard to keep up, and technicians need to know the data immediately, without any delay. So they need to act on it real time. So this is what our architecture will look like, once we have it all set up. So here we have essentially 130 million meter readings that we're going to be feeding into a Kafka broker. This is our own in-house Kafka broker that's sitting on a fairly modest box in AWS. And then we're going to be spinning up a Helios cluster and ingesting data using pipelines. So you'll see basically the creation of the tables and creation of pipelines in the demo today. And we'll also start writing some queries to see how they perform, what kind of answers we can get out of the data. We'll take a look at MemSQL Studio, which is the front end for MemSQL for managing cluster health, looking at active processes, and just running SQL queries. And then finally, we'll go to the Looker dashboard. Looker, if you don't already know, is a BI tool. MemSQL connects to a variety of BI tools, and we'll be using Looker for this demo. So we'll see how dashboards and charts perform in a real-time setting with MemSQL underneath. All right, so it's time to spin up the cluster. Now, if you don't already have a portal account, then just go to portal.memsql.com and create an account so that you'll have the ability to spin up free trial clusters whenever you want. But if you already have a login and you're already logged in, then you'll be able to easily follow. So once you're in, go to clusters and go to create cluster. So this is where we'll be creating essentially a Helios cluster that we'll use for demonstration purposes today. So I'm going to call this a demo cluster, and we can pick which region we want to be in. So because all my other applications are in AWS Virginia, we're going to leave it at that. We're going to leave the cluster size at 4 units. These are the other options that you have, but we'll go with a modest small size cluster to start off with. It also shows you an estimation of what the total cost will be if it's not a free trial. So here we set the cluster password, and this is basically the password that we'll have to use to log into the cluster. So we'll do that. And then here's where you configure cluster access restrictions. So for now, I'm going to add my own IP address, but later on, I'll be adding my Kafka broker or any other application that I need to whitelist to make sure that it can connect to my Helios cluster. So let's kick it off. So as we can see, the cluster is currently reconciling. So this process normally takes about 5 to 6 minutes. So we'll give it some time and then we'll get going. All right, so we have the cluster up and running, and we can see that we have the connection information here. And there's a couple different things going on here. So MemSQL Studio, like I was saying earlier, is going to be your front-end interface to interacting with Helios, so you can manage cluster health and look at write SQL queries and look at what else is going on in the cluster. And these are your endpoints to be able to connect from external applications either an IDE of your choice or even just, a plain JDBC connection from your own app. So let's start with MemSQL Studio. This will bring you to the login page where you'll enter the password that you set during the cluster creation phase. And then this is what the home page looks like. It'll show you what the cluster health currently is, how many nodes do you have. Now, the only reason it says it's 7 nodes is because there's 4 leaf nodes, 4 units, the cluster that we created, and the other 3 are aggregators. Cluster usage will show you how much memory and disk usage currently it is. When there's a pipeline running, it will show you rows written per second. But as we can see, there's literally nothing in the cluster right now. There's no pipelines and there's no data. So let's change that. All right, so let's go to the SQL editor here on the left sidebar and load a SQL file that has my schemas in it. So this is what the file looks like. It's going to create this database called utility. It's going to create a bunch of tables that we can cover in depth later. Most of these are going to be column store actually. Now, if you don't know the difference between row store and column store, just a quick overview is that the row store tables are completely in memory, and the column store tables are stored on disk, where we do leverage memory for ingestion purposes and speeding up performance. So let's scroll back up and hit run. Perfect. All right. So it looks like we have the utility database here. Now, if we do a quick show tables, we'll see that all these tables were successfully created. So now that we have the databases and tables in place, the next step is to create the pipelines that's going to be ingesting the data into these tables. So for that, I also have this pipelines.sql file that has create or replace pipeline essentially for all the tables. And some of these will be going into a stored procedure. Some of these will be going into a table. So before we run these commands, let's start this is the Kafka cluster. So let's start writing to Kafka, and then we'll create the pipelines to start ingesting the data. So now that this is running, one by one, we can create the pipelines. Awesome. And now that we have them in place, let's start everything. Cool. So all 3 of these pipelines are now running, and then we can verify by going to the dashboard, and we'll be able to see that as soon as we go back to the dashboard, we'll see that the total memory usage and total disk usage is already updated. And we can see that, well, how many rows we're writing per second. So it's ranging from about 1 to 2 million every batch. So now that the data is flowing in at a steady pace, let's look at some SQL queries and see what kind of data we have. So I also have a SQL file written with all the queries. So we'll start with something simple, right? So AMI alarms is essentially a table that's specifically for any alarms. So if any meter has a extremely high reading or extremely low reading, and a technician needs to look at it immediately, then it goes directly into the AMI alarms table. And then we'll be able to see here, hey, I want to see, I can see that I have 21, almost 22,000 alarms right now. How many of them are high? So we'll see that about 450 of them are high read alarms, and how many of them are just voltages completely out of bounds. So a lot of them are out of bounds right now. And then we have this query shows you alarms by type over time. So here we can see, the data we were ingesting is out of date, but it is ingesting right now. So we'll see that essentially, over time in, any given date, how many alarms were there for a specific type of alarm. And then we also do daily aggregation on the fly. So, once we have um, all the data, raw data coming in, we can have a stored procedure running in the background that sort of aggregates the data so that we can make sense of it. And this just organizes the data so that it's on reads on a daily basis. So we can see that, hey, this meter ID on this specific date had this average rating, and this and the sum was this. Same goes for a year and month aggregation. So we'll be able to see that on a monthly basis how the meters are performing. And a meter here is just any device or any tenant for that matter that's sending data. We have some more queries like highest and lowest consumption. And we also have exactly this data set hooked up to a Looker dashboard where we can see, visualize the data that's coming in and even look at it update in real time. Also, just as an FYI, the data that we have looked at so far does not include all the raw data that we have ingested so far. We're only looking at a subset of it and only basically looking at queries that may make sense. If we want to look at basically all the data that's been ingested so far, then we have this AMI reads table that basically our pipeline and Kafka topic are going into. So if I run this number should be high. So this is about 110 million records ingested so far. And every time I run it, it should increase. So it looks like it's increasing by about a million or so every second or every 2 seconds. And this is just the count of all the alarms. So basically, all the meter ratings that actually do need attention by someone right now. So this number is about 127K right now. So let's go over to Looker, like I was talking about, and then see a dashboard in action that's being powered by MemSQL. So this number should be in line with the count that's here. So we'll see this. Okay, there it is. So this number is uh, essentially the total number of alarms that's coming from AMI alarms table. And then we're also have these other modules here that show you that how many of them are high, low, and how many of them are just out of bounds. And then we also have this line chart here that shows you sort of on a trend basis how many alarms have shown up in which months, in which dates, and you can dig in deeper into each of these metrics if you wish. Now, one thing to note here is that this dashboard is actually set to refresh every second. So if I go to settings, you'll see that all of these charts on this dashboard are actually auto refreshing every 1 second. So what that means is every second, at least 6 queries are being fired off to the MemSQL cluster. And it's important that MemSQL is able to keep up with with the amount of queries that are hitting the cluster on a second basis. And I've done this test with other databases out there, and basically they just choke up because if you don't get a response in a second, the dashboard will just stop updating because it waits for a response before it can run a query again, so it just get confused. So this is supposed to be real time. It's updating in real time, so anyone can get a view on what's going on right now, versus if you have to wait for ETLs and if you have to wait for data to be loaded before you can start querying it, then there's really no point in doing operational analytics. Now there's other dashboards that we can look at too. So let me go back to my home page. and click here. So this dashboard is going to display basically the daily aggregation query that we were running in Studio, but except here it's in a chart format, so it's a little bit easier for you to make sense of what's going on. So as we can see, let's say in the month of July on this date, the average meter reading was maybe at an all-time high. And then you can scroll down and see what other charts we have. So we have this basically table chart here that tells you what was the aggregation date, um, and what was the average of all the meters that were running at the time when this data was collected. Same goes for here. Now this one basically breaks down by meter ID. So if you're only interested in specific meter IDs, like if you're only interested in looking at your top 5 customers or companies that are producing basically the most energy, then you can focus solely on those by filtering down to specific meter IDs. So we can see that, hey, this meter ID 12030 has this average. And then you can, have it in a bar chart, pie chart, however you imagine it. And also one thing to note is that this dashboard is also live. So as you can see, this one is also updating every second. We just don't see that movement as fast as we do in the other one, because this basically spreads throughout the time, versus the other one was focusing on just the numbers that were coming through via alerts. All right, let's review what we have so far. So far what we did was we have a Kafka cluster set up that was ingesting data into a Kafka topic using dummy data that had hundreds of millions of records. So what we did was we created a memSQL pipeline that accepted data from this Kafka topic. So we basically subscribed to Kafka, get all the data into memSQL tables. All of that is, of course, done on a Helios cluster with four leaf nodes, essentially 4 units. We wrote some user queries, and we saw really high performance. Most of the queries were coming back in less than a couple 100 milliseconds, which is considered blazing fast. And all of that was done while the data was actively being ingested. So it's really important, an important design element of memSQL and Helios, that you're able to read data while it's being written into the tables. We took a tour of memSQL Studio, which is a SQL interface, but also lets you manage cluster health and profile queries and do lots of other things like manage nodes, and just see your cluster health overall. And then finally, we went over to Looker to look at some real-time dashboards and see how they perform as the data is actively being ingested into tables. We saw that the dashboard was being updated every second, and memSQL Helios was able to keep up with it amazingly. So now that we saw this use case, let's consider something else. In a world where you can't have any lags, and you can't have a Kafka cluster sitting in between your OLTP system and your OLAP system. So in that scenario, comes in memSQL replicant, which basically accepts data in a CDC format from your OLTP system. So whether that's some of the legacy systems like Oracle, or it could be, some of the modern systems like AWS Aurora, where you're producing basically what you're transacting on, and basically what is your system of record. Now, how do you get that data into memSQL? So memSQL actually provides with a replicant / CDC tool for you to be able to, in real time, replicate data from your transactional systems to memSQL. So we'll review how that looks like. And in this example, we're going to use an Oracle database that I have set up on AWS. And we're going to start ingesting data into the Oracle database, and then we'll start the CDC, and then we'll see how memSQL is replicating that data. And then we will also look at some more real-time dashboards. All right, so for this second use case, let's imagine that we have a billing application running on Oracle. And we don't have Kafka or anything in the middle to ingest data into MemSQL. So what we're going to leverage here is MemSQL CTC/replicant. So if I run these queries right now for bills and payments, we'll see that there's 0 records right now in MemSQL. So what I'm going to do is start inserting data into my Oracle database, and then start the replicant process so that we'll start seeing the data also being duplicated into MemSQL. So here I have my Oracle instance. So let me do this. I'm going to start the process of inserting data into these bills and payments tables on the Oracle side. So, I started this process of inserting the data. Now again, I haven't started replicant yet, so we won't see any data being replicated in MemSQL just yet. So I have this script here that I'm going to leverage. Boom. All right. So let me expand this. All right. So we'll see the progress here going from Oracle to MemSQL. So we're seeing that it's about 18% done. It's still replicating, and there's different progress for different situations. So if I do this, we'll see that there's 784,000 records already in the bills table. And if I run this on here, we'll see that there's about the same on payments as well. So as the next step, let's go to Looker. And so this is the billing dashboard that's essentially based on MemSQL that's actively being replicated from Oracle. Now, again, this one is also set to essentially refresh every 1 second, but this is for anyone to keep tabs on, hey, how many bills have we sent out? How many payments have come in for the amount of bills? We can break it down by industries. There's more data here on billing, on what actions were taken, what type of actions were taken, the interval. So there's a couple tables, and then there's a payments table that basically breaks it down where a full payment wasn't made versus just partial, adjusted, or credit. So most of this data is being updated in real time. So we may see some of these numbers move. So as we saw, some of these numbers are moving in real time. And we just started the CDC process about a minute ago, and we already have close to 1.2 million records in the table. Now, MSQL is also perfectly suitable for ad hoc exploration as well. So, if you just want to dive deep into the data and just see what's going on, you're absolutely can write queries such as these, where this is a query where it will tell me all the payments that were made after February, but which one of them are pending. So if I run this query right here, we'll see that it basically shows us all the payments that were made recently, but are basically in the status of pending. So if I need to dive deeper into any of these, I can. Now, one thing to also explore in MemSQL Helio Studio is if you're having query performance issues with some of the more complicated queries, like for example, this one is extremely fast, but if it wasn't, what you would be able to do is you would be able to profile the query. And this will essentially show you in a very nice flowchart method of what components of the query took the longest. Let me zoom out right here. And this one's a very straightforward query. As we can see, it starts off with basically just gathering the data. And then this one does a column store filter on basically just these date types. And this one took 100% of the time, which was again not that much. And it also shows you how many segments were scanned, what the total time was, and memory usage, actual row count, so you can see if the statistics are up to date or not. And this is the estimated versus this is the actual. So you can also sort of see a breakdown that way. Now, what else is there in Studio? There's active processes. So what we can do is, since we have this dashboard essentially running against SQL, um, we have resource usage that we can start begin profiling. So let me do this. So why don't I let this run for maybe about 5 more seconds, and then we'll see um, how it looks like. So okay, let me just hit finish. So, in that whole 10, 11 seconds that we were profiling, it basically collects all the queries that ran at the time. So here are essentially the queries that are being run by Looker. It shows you how many times the queries ran. It shows you how much time was spent on it, what resources were used. So it's extremely nice way for you to get a sense of how many resources will be used when you do run particular queries. So we saw visual explain, we saw active processes, we saw resource usage. Again, here's pipeline, so you can keep an eye on all the Kafka pipelines that are running from before. Here you can take a look at databases to see essentially how much data we have so far. And here are all the nodes. So as I mentioned before, you have 3 aggregators, 1 master and 2 child. The rest are all leaf nodes, so you can also monitor CPU usage and memory usage in real time on all of these nodes using SQL Studio. So thank you guys for your time today. If you already haven't spun up a Helios cluster, then on the left side, the link is there to create your own account in our portal so that you can spin up free trials for MemSQL Helios. And then on the right side, if you already have done the free trial, you've already played around with it, and you just want to talk to someone, want more information, maybe something we didn't get a chance to cover today, please feel free to email us at heliosinfo@memsql.com. The email address is also on your screen on the right side. Thank you guys so much.